Hey there, Human Geography. In this video, we're going to be covering the results of imperialism, European imperialism, and colonialism, as well as a little bit of a recap of what happened. And as you can tell from this slide, we're going to be focusing on the continent of Africa. It was not the only continent imperialized. It just happens that it was the continent that was almost entirely imperialized by the Europeans, which means that it's a little bit easier for us to sum everything up by looking at this one place. Also, Africa happens to be the place that countries got their independence most recently. So that means the effects of imperialism are still glaringly obvious to see and still going on today. All right, so you'll remember from before that when it came to imperialism, the French and the British took the largest slices. And when it came to Africa specifically, you'll remember that there was the Berlin Conference where Europeans decided to divvy up Africa amongst themselves without consulting a single African about it. And that's what you're looking at here in this map. Red is British holdings, green is French holdings, and then you've got Italy and Germany and Belgium all kind of thrown in here as well. Okay, what you need to understand today is a little bit more about the imperial practices, European colonial and imperial practices, and how they played out and what effects they cause today. So, as rulers of the places that they colonized or imperialized, Europeans' number one job was number one drive was to exploit the resources there and exploit the people there as labor, slave labor, essentially. So that gave Europeans the resources that they needed or wanted, that is, to really fuel their industrial revolution. By the way, that industrial revolution allowed the Europeans the ability to imperialize the world. And so industrialism becomes super important here, and you'll see it as we go along. Okay, to maintain control over different places, different European rulers manipulated different ethnic groups in the local regions, usually to fight against each other. The idea being that if there were multiple different factions inside of a place that the Europeans ruled, and those factions were against each other, then they were less able to focus on getting rid of their imperial overlords or captors. So if the Europeans could play the ethnicities against each other, then it was in favor of the Europeans. Okay, another thing that really took away a lot of the ability of people who were colonized or imperialized to fight back was to erase their culture. One of those ways was to send missionaries to convert them to different religions. Because as you've seen in the religion chapter, religion is a massive part of identity, of cultural identity. And if the Europeans could take that away, then they could take away something that people would be willing to fight for. So that was a major goal of missionaries, or a major reason that European countries would really encourage missionaries to go and change local cultures. Okay, as we really see today, what ends up happening a lot was Europeans created borders in their imperial holdings based on what they needed rather than on any concept of local ethnicity. And the problem that we see today is that a lot of those borders that the Europeans established are still the borders that are used today, which cause lots of problems because the ethnicities that either should be together or shouldn't be together either are or aren't, because the Europeans didn't care. And a lot of times it played in their favor. Okay, so note that this is coming from my slides. This video here is a good one for you to check out. It's real short, but it kind of gives you a quick overview as to how some of the different practices were carried out. And it is graphic. I do warn you ahead of time. Okay. So when it comes to different colonial or imperial practices, there were different ones. And these are things that you should understand, especially when it comes to Britain and France, because they really had different approaches to it. France, like I said before, France kind of went out there with the idea of erasing local cultures so that people had less of an identity to defend, and therefore less of a desire or ability to fight back. So when the French colonized a place, they tended to try to assimilate the people there, the ethnicities there, into French culture. That's why you see so many different African countries today that speak French, because the Europeans made sure to get rid of local languages, get rid of local religions, and make people feel French, or remove their own culture, so that there was less of an ability to fight back, or maybe more of an affinity for the people who were ruling over them. Okay. Now, this was good and bad. It was good in that today, in a lot of the former French colonies, we see a lot more peaceful relations among the ethnicities, but that's because those different ethnicities have lost their cultural heritage to a certain degree, or to a large degree, depending. And that would be the downside. We lose a lot of that diversity. The British, on the other hand, used the identities against each other, which meant that the British really wanted people to maintain their ethnic identities. Because if they could set them against each other, then the ethnicities in the local regions were less likely to fight back against the British, because they were focused in other places. So again, this has good and bad effects today. The good being that we still have those diverse cultures, that people in those different countries still have those ethnicities and those different identities and those different perspectives that are really important today. But at the same time, because of that, and because of the history of the Brits setting them against each other, we see a lot more conflict in former British colonies, because the people there agree less, and there's more tension. They conflict more. There's more friction. Okay. As you can see here, African countries largely got their independence in the 1960s, in the early 1960s. If you look through there, you see a lot of those dates are 1960 or 1961. And note that that kind of coincides with a lot of the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. What this means, though, is that many of the African countries today have only been independent for less than 100 years. And those first years of independence are very difficult, because you have to establish new things. You have to establish a new identity. You have to establish a new government. You have to establish military and control and all those things. And these things are usually up in the air for quite some time. To add to it, these countries have been exploited by imperial powers and held back from industrializing, so that, because remember, like I said before, a lot of the reason European countries were able to colonize was because they had industrialism, or industrialization. They were able to make weapons, manufacture weapons. They were able to make goods that were better for trade and things like that. And so when they imperialized places, they made sure that most of the places that were imperialized did not get industry, because that industry would allow those places to rise up against their imperial captors, essentially. Right? So, what you're looking at here is a whole bunch of African countries who've been purposely held back from industrialization and held back from being able to govern themselves. And now they're trying to figure out both at the same time, while large areas of the rest of the world have industrialized, are ahead economically, are ahead militarily, so on and so forth. Okay, so that really gets us going into the problems of independence. And this is for anyone who gets their independence from a colonial power. But we are going to look relatively specifically at African countries again, because they're the youngest, essentially. Okay, so one of the major problems of freedom from imperialism is that somehow, when the imperial powers pulled out of the different areas, the borders that they had established largely stayed. Go back to the map for a second, and I'll point out again all those straight lines on that map. You see Egypt here with all these straight lines. You see the lines between Algeria, Niger, and Mali, right? You see straight lines that don't exist in nature. Mostly borders are based on physical features, which aren't straight. If they're straight, it's because somebody drew some random lines on a map because of what fit for them. And usually that's on the outside. It's called a superimposed border, and you're going to be talking about that later in this unit. Okay, so those borders really mess things up, because mostly they were created without regard for who was there. And those borders then create a whole lot of conflicts that still exist today. You get the conflicts where certain ethnicities that shouldn't be together are, that historically were separate from each other, are now bunched together and expected to work together as a country. So now we're talking like multinational versus multi-ethnic countries. Or you get ethnicities that were divided by a random superimposed border and are trying to get back together. You remember that from ethnicity, the irredentism idea, the idea of trying to regain an ethnic homeland. That also leads to conflicts. Okay, such as Sudan and South Sudan. The Brits had control of Sudan, which was three major racial divisions and a whole bunch more major ethnic divisions. When they left, they decided to group them all together, and then they left. Everybody's like, yeah, those borders are good, except for the people in Sudan. So then they fought out a civil war just recently, which actually they're still fighting along the border to try to figure out how the border is going to work. Largely, Sudan is Arabic and Muslim. South Sudan is largely Black and Christian. And then you've got the other Muslim ethnicities on the side who see the difference between North and South, and that South got its independence, and then the ones on the West side are now trying to break away from that. That's all because they were just randomly clustered together. Okay, you see the same thing in Rwanda and Uganda. All the stuff that's going on there is because of colonialism. In Rwanda, for example, the Belgians purposely put one ethnicity, the Tutsis, in essentially political control. Like the Belgians worked very closely with the Tutsis as administrators of the colony, and they used the other big ethnicity, the Hutus, as manual labor, slave labor. So what ended up happening is these two ethnicities that used to relatively get along now have lived in centuries of one being over the other. And the ones at the bottom, slave labor, they don't want to be the slave labor. They'd rather be at the top. The ones who are on the top, they don't want to be labor. They don't want to lose their position at the top. So they're fighting each other, and that has led to genocide, trying to wipe each other out. Uganda is seeing the same types of problems among different ethnicities. Okay, another problem after independence is food shortages. Wait, why? Why would you have food shortages after independence? Well, there's a number of reasons. Um, Remember that the Europeans were there to exploit natural resources. They didn't care how the land was taken care of. They just wanted the stuff that they needed, the rubber, the oil, those kind of things, those things that people don't eat, but that are good for manufacturing. And those things tended to overwork the land. People also maybe lost their cultural traditions of being able to grow food in certain cultural ways that match the climate. Those disappear, people go back to having to feed themselves, and maybe they don't know how to do it, or maybe the land won't support it anymore. Also, there's a lot of pressure from different governments to try to fit into a global economy where agricultural goods are the least profitable thing you can have. Industrial goods are much more profitable. So there's a pressure by countries to develop industry, but that comes at the cost of developing food for the people. So then there's that balance. Do we feed ourselves and survive? Or do we try to develop an economy and survive by being able to actually have money and compete in the world? Another major problem after independence is health, the health of the general people who are there. Again, these are places that have been purposely held back by imperial powers from being able to industrialize. And that includes, remember, one of the first things that comes with the industry is medicine, medical technology. Now, that's not to say that people in different African countries don't have medical technology. Sure, it's there, but the access is tends to be difficult. It's not as spread or diffused throughout society. Medical services tend to be focused in the major cities, and those major cities tend to be relatively few and far between, which makes it very difficult for people to get the care that they need. Okay. And some places simply don't have the medical technology because they're too far away from infrastructure to be able to. That is one of the major reasons that AIDS became a major epidemic and is still a major epidemic throughout Africa, is because of lack of diffusion of medical technology. Okay, last one. Oppressive governments is a massive problem. Because remember, these are new governments, largely. These are governments that are less than 100 years old, which means oftentimes because of clustered or divided ethnicities, there's not a clear defined leadership who should be in charge. Remember, Rwanda, they're essentially fighting out about who should be in charge. New governments in general, historically, are not stable. The United States government, after we broke away from Britain, was definitely not stable for a while, which led to the Civil War almost 100 years later. So, new governments in general, usually not stable. We're also talking about places that don't have a lot of infrastructure or industry, which makes it hard for them, newly formed governments, to maintain order throughout their territory. They either don't have the technology or ability to travel in cars and planes between and to get word out, things like that. They don't necessarily have phones or internet throughout the country to be able to keep connected with people. And they maybe don't have the military to be able to protect different areas against uprisings. Okay. Also, ethnic divides that we've talked about, that we've been constantly talking about through here, those create instability as well, right? Who's in charge? How do we reunite? Those kind of things. How do we get along as different ethnicities in one country, multinational countries, right? Okay. Lack of ability to maintain order leads to warlords. This is something that you should understand. Warlords are people who arise in a particular area and hold power just by being the biggest, strongest, baddest guy with the most guns. They are not good leaders, typically. However, newly formed countries have a hard time fighting those. Remember, there's that inability to necessarily get the military where it needs to go to defend from warlords. And these warlords will often snatch up whatever resources they can to put themselves in charge. And then they'll rule however they want to, which is usually, I got the biggest stick, so I'm going to do stick. Stick is what I said. So I'm going to do what I want. Okay. There's also major economic problems after independence, especially when we're talking about independence today. People who have been historically held back from industrializing, they're not going to have the money to fit into an industrial economy, which is the global economy. So many of African countries specifically, because they're so new, had to borrow a lot of money from the people who used to rule them as imperial powers, which means that a lot of African countries quickly went in debt, because how do you pay that back if you don't have the industry to be able to create an economy? How do you pay it back when you're still struggling to even feed yourself, right? And this leads to, right. Plus, a lot of places already had their resources depleted or controlled by MDCs, remember, more developed countries. Again, a lot of these um, earlier imperial powers already control a lot of the resources. Say, for instance, in Mongolia, I know it's not in Africa, but it gives you a good idea of how it's throughout the world. Mongolia has basically the corner on rare earth minerals. They have the most rare earth minerals in the world, just geographically located there, geologically located there. But China, because it's more developed, has been able to buy all of the mines. So the Mongolians end up working in the mines and don't end up making any money from the resources that are in their own country. It's the same deal throughout many, many former imperial holdings. Okay. And this leads to the idea of economic imperialism. The idea that, yeah, we don't imperialize people anymore through military force for the most part, but do we imperialize by having a better economy and making sure that people who don't have as good of an economy never have as good of an economy, just to make sure that we stay on top? So is that a new form of imperialism? Okay, lastly, and I know you can't see it because of the toolbar at the bottom, I don't know why that came up and won't go away. There's the idea of dependency theory. This idea that we, the more developed countries of the world, lend to less developed countries of the world, which makes them dependent on us because they'll never be able to pay back their debt as long as we keep them down. Now, again, that's a theory. Let me point out that that's a theory. I'm not saying that this definitely occurs, but you can see how people might make that argument. Okay. Lots of problems after independence. And this is why I say the two C's are the things that are the most common causes of problems today. One of those major C's being colonialism, the other being the Cold War. Okay, lastly, are there still colonial possessions today? Yes. Throughout, mostly in the Pacific Ocean. Guam, for instance, Johnston Island, things like that, the Virgin Islands, all sorts of different uh, islands typically are still colonial possessions today. Anyway, I hope that helps you understand the repercussions of imperialism that we still face today. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.